In May of 2023, a small team of scientists carried 10 sealed transport boxes down to the edge of a river an hour south of Sydney, in the oldest national park in Australia. Inside those boxes were 10 platypuses, and the river they were about to be released into hadn't held a single one in roughly 50 years. The people lowering those boxes to the water were hoping for survival. 10 animals is a fragile number to rebuild anything from. One bad drought, one fox, one stretch of river that turned out to be quietly poisoned, and the whole thing could be over before the first breeding season. That's not what happened. Survival, it turned out, was almost the easy part. So was settling in. The thing the team could not promise. The thing that no amount of planning can engineer, because it has to happen on the animal's terms, in the dark, underground, where no camera can follow, was whether this river could make a new platypus. Whether a stretch of water everyone had written off as ecologically dead could on its own produce life that had never lived anywhere else. 3 years later, they found their answer pressed into the mud of the riverbank, and it had a name. This the story of how Australia's most improbable animal vanished from its most famous park. How a small team spent years quietly preparing the ground to bring it back, and what the most recent survey, completed just weeks ago, revealed about a river that everyone alive had assumed was simply empty. But to understand why this matters, you have to start with what was actually lost. And you need to understand this animal, because it's stranger and more important than the cartoon you're picturing. When most people think of a platypus, they think of a curiosity, a duck's bill stuck onto an otter's body, a punchline of evolution. That framing badly undersells it. The platypus is a monotomb, one of only a handful of mammals on Earth that lays eggs instead of giving birth. The males carry venomous spurs on their hind legs, strong enough to drop a dog and to leave a grown human in pain for weeks. It has no stomach, in the way you'd understand the word, and that famous bill isn't for show. It's a sensory instrument. The platypus hunts with its eyes, ears, and nostrils sealed shut underwater, navigating entirely by detecting the faint electrical fields thrown off by the muscles of its prey. It is functionally hunting by electricity in total darkness. But none of that is the reason its absence mattered. The reason its absence mattered is what the platypus is to a river. A platypus cannot live in bad water. It needs clean, well-oxygenated streams, intact banks soft enough to dig burrows into, and a dense, healthy population of aquatic insects and larvae to eat. Remove any one of those, and the platypus is the first thing to disappear. Which means that when a river loses its platypus, the platypus is rarely the whole problem. It's the symptom. It's the river telling you, in the bluntest language it has, that something underneath has broken. Conservationists have a term for an animal like this: an indicator species, a living gauge of a whole system's health. When the platypus is thriving, it means the insects are thriving, which means the water is clean, which means the banks are holding, which means the entire web beneath the surface is intact. So when you lose it, you haven't just lost a charming animal. You've lost your read on whether the river is alive at all. And in this particular river, that gauge went dark for half a century. The place is Royal National Park on the traditional lands of the Darawal people. It was declared in 1879, which makes it the second oldest national park on the planet after Yellowstone. The Hacking River runs through the heart of it, and for generations the platypus was simply part of that river, common enough that nobody thought to count them. Then they were gone. What exactly happened is something scientists are honest about not fully knowing, and that honesty matters here. The leading theory, the one repeated most often, is dramatic and specific. A fatal crash on the Prince's Highway, which runs right alongside the park, sometime around the late 1970s or early 80s. A vehicle went into the waterway. Chemicals washed downstream. And a population that was already under pressure never recovered. But the researchers who study this are careful to say it was almost certainly not one single event. The platypuses of the Royal were being squeezed long before that crash. Silt washing down from upstream development, the legacy of a nearby coal operation, riverbanks degrading, the slow fragmenting of the habitat that connects one stretch of water to the next. The crash, if it happened the way the story says, may have simply been the final shove to a population already standing at the edge. However it happened, the result was the same. By the turn of the century, the platypus was gone from the Royal, and it stayed gone so long that an entire generation of visitors grew up walking those riverbanks with no idea anything was missing. The empty river became the normal river. Here's where the story turns. And it turns on a piece of science that didn't exist a generation ago. In 2021, a UNSW team working with local volunteers went to the Hacking River to settle a question that had only ever been guesswork. Were the platypuses truly gone, or just unseen? They didn't go looking for the animals directly. They went looking for their ghosts. Every animal that moves through water sheds traces of itself. Skin cells, fluids, fragments of DNA into the current. Scientists can now scoop up a sample of river water and read those fragments like a guest list of everything that's been there. It's called environmental DNA, eDNA. They sampled the Hacking River and the creek that feeds it. And the results came back showing the signatures of around 250 different species of land and water life. 250, and not one of them was a platypus. That's the moment the absence stopped being a rumor and became a fact. The river was full of life. It was simply missing the one animal that had once defined it, a crowded river with a platypus-shaped hole in it. But that same test carried a second, quieter message. 250 species means the water itself was recovering. The insects were there. The food was there. The industrial pressures of the previous century had slowly eased. The river wasn't dead anymore. It was empty. And empty is a problem you can fix. So a coalition formed to fix it. UNSW's Platypus Conservation Initiative, WWF Australia, the Taronga Conservation Society, and the New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service. Led by Associate Professor Gilad Bino, an ecologist who has spent years mapping the platypus's quiet national decline. And they did not rush it. For 2 years before a single animal was moved, they tested. They mapped the depth of every pool, because in a drought, a platypus stranded between shrinking pools has to cross dry land, where the foxes and the cats are waiting. They checked the banks for digging. They counted the insects to make sure there was enough to eat. They ran sensor cameras to measure how many predators were really out there. Reintroduction isn't releasing an animal and hoping. It's making sure the table is set before you invite the guest. Then, in May 2023, they brought the first 10. Sourced from healthy populations elsewhere in New South Wales. Each one health-checked, each one fitted with a tiny acoustic transmitter so the team could follow it as a network of underwater receivers pinged its movements up and down the river. 10 boxes, 10 platypuses. The first platypus reintroduction ever attempted in the state of New South Wales. And then they had to do the hardest thing in this entire field. Wait, the first signals were good. Of the 10, 9 settled in fast. The tracking data showed them holding territory, feeding, behaving exactly like platypuses in a river they belonged to. The 10th, a female, kept wandering off the edge of the tracking grid entirely, which alarmed the team until they realized she was simply exploring further than anyone expected. She knew the river better than her transmitter did, but settling in is not the same as succeeding. 10 adults in a river is a holding pattern. It's a population on life support, kept alive by the humans who put it there. For this to become real, for it to become a recovery, the river had to start doing the work itself. So in May of 2025, the team added 3 more animals, not a rescue, a widening of the gene pool to give whatever happened next the genetic room to last. And then, this past May, in 2026, they returned with 4 more, 2 males, Absinthe and Ducky, and 2 females, Hydra and Dawn. That brought the total number of platypuses ever carried into this river to 17. But when they ran the full survey alongside that release, the number that came back wasn't 17. It was 20. 20 known platypuses in a river that, 5 years ago, had exactly 0. 17 had been carried in by human hands. The others had not. The others had been born there. During that survey, the team pulled up a young male, a subadienal, hatched in the Hacking River during the most recent breeding season. An animal that had never known a transport box. That had begun its life in the dark of a burrow dug into a bank that, a few years earlier, no platypus had touched in half a century. And he wasn't the first. The previous year, the team had confirmed the very first juvenile born in the park, a young platypus they named Geely. They even identified the father, one of the original 10 founders, a male named Prometheus, who, along with another of the first arrivals named Norris, the team re-encountered during this survey, still alive, still in excellent condition years after release. Sit with what that means. The founding animals weren't just surviving, they were raising the next generation. There were now multiple ages of platypus in the river. Founders, their offspring, and the offspring's own cohort, interacting the way a healthy, self-sustaining population does. That is the line the lead researchers themselves drew. This is no longer a reintroduction. A reintroduction is something humans do to a river. What's happening in the Hacking now is something the river is doing on its own. It has started making platypuses again. And this is the part worth being precise about, because it's bigger than one park. The platypus is not in trouble in one river. It's in trouble across its entire range. A landmark assessment by UNSW scientists found that the area of eastern Australia, where platypuses can still live, has shrunk by as much as 22% in just 30 years, pushed back by land clearing, by dammed and diverted rivers, by deeper and longer droughts. The International Union for Conservation of Nature now lists the species as near threatened. Some researchers describe what's happening to it as a silent extinction, a disappearance so quiet, so gradual, that most people will never notice the gauge going dark. Which is exactly what makes the Hacking River matter beyond its own banks. Because it's a working answer to a specific and frightening question. If we lose a platypus population, can we actually put one back? Not just keep the animals alive, but restart the whole self-sustaining cycle, the breeding, the generations, the river caring for itself again. For the first time in New South Wales, the answer coming back is yes. It is, by the researchers' own description, one of the most ambitious wildlife recovery projects ever attempted in the state. And so far, it's working. But the detail I keep returning to isn't in the data. It's the people walking the riverbank. For 50 years, you could stand beside the Hacking River and you would not see a platypus, because there were none to see. That absence was so total, so long, that it stopped being an absence at all. It was just what the river was. And now the team says visitors are reporting sightings again. People stopping on a path, pointing at the water, watching that low brown ripple move upstream in the early light, on the lands of the Darawal, in the country's oldest park, for the first time in living memory. A whole generation grew up never knowing this river was supposed to have a platypus in it. The next one won't have to imagine it. And that's the thread I keep finding in these stories. We tend to imagine recovery as something we do to a landscape, something we engineer and manage and control. The hacking river suggests something humbler. The team didn't restore the river. They couldn't. No human can dig a platypus burrow or raise a platypus young or decide, in the dark of a breeding season, that a river is finally safe enough to bring new life into. What they did was clean the water, set the table, carry the animal home, and then get out of its way. The river took it from there. If this changed the way you think about what's actually possible, about whether locally extinct really has to mean forever, tell me in the comments. And tell me which animal you think we should be trying to bring home next. If it moved you, share it with someone who still thinks the platypus is just a punchline. And subscribe, because there are far more of these comebacks happening right now than you'd ever guess. Quietly, river by river. And I've got a lot more of them to tell you. Thanks for watching.